Hello and good morning to all of you. A late good evening to those of you in Japan joining us today. We really appreciate you staying awake to be here so late with us. Thank you for joining us for today's policy briefing, Soft Power and Morals in U.S. Foreign Policy with Dr. Joseph S. Nye, Jr. My name is Shanti Shoji, Director of Programs at Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Sasakawa USA is a nonpartisan 501c3 organization dedicated to deepening the understanding of and strengthening the relationship between the US and Japan for the benefit of a free and open international community. Our activities mainly focus on security and diplomacy through the engagement of exchanges, dialogue, analysis, publications, and networking. It's truly a delight to have Dr. and I join our advisory committee on projects, along with Ambassador Milan Verveer, Secretary Randall Shriver, and Ambassador Kurt Tong. I really look forward to picking your brain, Dr. Nye, to further develop our programs here at Sasakawa USA. Just a few housekeeping issues I'd like to go over today. The event is being recorded, as you've seen, and we will have a recap available on Sasakawa USA's site in the coming weeks. There will be a Q&A session later in the program. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit a question, and you can do that anytime throughout the session, and we will go through those at the end. With that, I'd like to now turn over the program to the moderator of today's event, Dr. Satohiro Akimoto, Chairman and President of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. Dr. Akimoto, yoroshiku onegai shimasu.
Well, thank you, Shanti. Good morning. I am Satohiro Akimoto, President and Chairman of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Joseph Nye, Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus at Harvard University, a member of Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA's Advisory Board on Programs. Professor Nye is globally known as an intellectual giant in political science, particularly in the field of neoliberalism of international relations. He needs no introduction, not only as a political scientist and a professor, but also as an academic administrator, a former dean of Kennedy School at Harvard, and a policymaker in administrations. We have some of his former students at the Kennedy School joining today, but in a way, we are all students of his because we always learn a lot from Joe. I'm delighted to have Joe talk about the importance of soft power and morality in shaping and providing a strong foundation combined with hard power to American foreign policies. I'm grateful for Joe to be willing to talk about this subject matter at this crucially important time for all of us, when the United States itself is sharply divided over fundamental political and cultural values. Democracy in America, which Tocqueville observed as a superb institution of governance in the new continent, with citizens' active participation in the process at the association level, seems to be under duress. Such internal political turmoil combined with economic difficulties, which many people are experiencing, seems to have created the mood for American people that we should focus on critical issues at home rather than issues of faraway places. As a result of this reluctance to take up major international leadership role, which may incur terrible cost, both human and money, by American people, generally speaking, United States as a whole, both right and left, seems to be in retreatment rather than engagement in international affairs. I think Joe's talk today has a lot to offer to think about these issues further. As I said, Joe needs no introduction, so I just wanted to touch upon his personal side before I ask him to speak. Joe is an avid outdoors man, reflecting his rural background. He's a fly fisherman and a deer hunter. He's the only Harvard professor who is a Democrat that I know who successfully shot a 12-point buck. Joe, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Satohiro. And it's a pleasure to be able to speak to our friends through the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. And The topic of soft power and morals in US foreign policy is particularly appropriate for this time because it not only affects the US-Japan relations, but it affects the larger role of the US in the world that you just discussed. What's particularly interesting is this transition we've seen from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. Trump, of course, was famous for his statement, America First. And Biden, of course, has been placing a great deal more emphasis on allies and multilateralism. So you have a very sharp contrast between two different styles of American foreign policy. And those two different styles, in terms of the emphasis that's given to moral values, does have an effect on American soft power. Just to remind people that soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. And for countries, it usually has three major sources. A country's values and when those are attractive to others, and its policies at home when it practices what it preaches, and also its foreign policies when those are seen as legitimate in the eyes of others. Those three things tend to increase the willingness of others to cooperate or to do things through attraction rather than coercion or payment. Now, if we look at the conventional wisdom that's often taught in graduate school about international politics, it's described as a dog-eat-dog world, and the only thing that really matters is the national interest. I remember once years ago when I was in the State Department negotiating all day with a French diplomat about matters related to nuclear nonproliferation. And at the end of the day, as we were having dinner, I said to him, do you ever worry or think about the moral implications of these topics that we've just been discussing? And his reply was very interesting. He said, no, there are no morals. The only thing that matters is the interests of France. And I don't think he realized what a profound moral judgment he had just made. But you often hear that, which is that everything is national interest. In fact, you could say that the conventional wisdom is that in international politics, national interests bake the cake, and then politicians come along and sprinkle a little morality on it like icing to make it look pretty, but it really doesn't matter all that much. There's also a tendency to distinguish interests from values that people sometimes say, well, was this an interest-based foreign policy or a values-based foreign policy? I think that's a false dichotomy, because I think values are a type of a national interest. They tell us who we are. And in that sense, it reflects on those issues about how we're divided or not at home that you mentioned. It also, values also tell us who we attract. And in other words, those values can tell us whether we do or don't have soft power. Let me take another point, which is that the issue is not national interest as such, but it's really more how we define national interest. In democratic theory, you would expect an elected president to defend the national interest first. That comes with the territory, so to speak. And in that sense, when Donald Trump says America first, you would say, well, there's nothing wrong with that in terms of democratic theory. Indeed, it's appropriate, just as you would expect Emmanuel Macron to say France first. But the interesting question about morals, it's not whether the leader defends the national interest, it's how the leader defines the national interest. And you can have leaders define the national interest in a very narrow and transactional way, which is very much the style that Donald Trump used, or you can have leaders define the national interest in a broad way that includes the interests of others. And so in that sense, this argument that it's national interest versus values, I think is a false dichotomy. Let me give you an example of the Marshall Plan and Harry Truman's definition of the national interest. After World War II, there was a question of what was going to happen to Europe, and would the European allies have to repay their loans which they'd received from the United States during the war? And many people thought back to the end of World War I, where the United States had insisted that the Europeans repay the loans. After World War II, when it became apparent that Europe was going through deep economic difficulties, Truman took a very different approach. And in the Marshall Plan, he devoted 2% of America's gross domestic product to helping European economies recover. And what's more, he set up a multilateral framework which allowed the Europeans to make decisions on how this money would be allocated and spent. What's interesting is that this approach was in the interests of the United States. It helped us protect Europe from being taken over by communism and the Soviet Union. So it helped us, but it also helped the Europeans in a way that insisting on their repayment of the loans would have been narrow and transactional, would have helped us, but not have helped the Europeans. So that's an example of what I mean about how you define the national interest makes such a big difference. And of course, the net effect of that was very important for American soft power. The Norwegian political scientist Geir Lundstad has said, yes, you can say that the American presence in Europe after World War II was something like an empire, but in his words, it was an empire by invitation. The Europeans wanted the United States there because they were attracted to the United States by essentially a values and benign policy. So I think that's a good example of what I mean about the role of values being important and the way they can affect on a country's soft power. Now, I think let's apply this to the current situation of the COVID-19 pandemic. The initial response of most countries is to take care of their own first, to vaccinate at home, so-called vaccine nationalism. But what's interesting is just as he left for the Group of Seven meeting yesterday, President Biden announced that the United States was going to purchase 500 million doses of vaccine and donate it for vaccinating the rest of the world through the COVAX facility of the World Health Organization. Before that, he had already designated 80 million doses that the Americans would be giving away this year. Now, I think the question you could ask is, and some people have asked, thinking back to national interest and vaccine nationalism, is, wait a minute, we have done a good job vaccination at home, but we're still not in a situation where the job is done. There are still 40% or so of Americans who are not vaccinated. What are we doing shipping vaccines abroad until we finish this job at home? And I've argued that there are really four good reasons why we should define our national interest as doing what Biden has just done. One is a health reason, which is in a world in which there are new variants of the virus, which are rising in populations that are unvaccinated, and those variants eventually can come back home to haunt us and to hurt us. It's in our interest, just like the Marshall Plan was in our interest, to vaccinate the rest of the world. The second point, of course, goes to values and our interests and values. We have a concern, humanitarian concern, for others in other countries and don't want to see them suffering. And the third reason why it's in our national interest is because it increases our soft power. Being seen as a country with a benign intent can, as I said earlier, increase our soft power. And fourth, and finally, of the four major reasons why Biden's actions today, I think, are so important, and is geopolitics. China and Russia have been trying to change the narrative, and particularly China's narrative about the origins of the COVID pandemic, by diverting attention to what China thinks is more benign behavior through personal protective equipment and vaccines. Why should the U.S. Allow that whole field of competition to be occupied by China or Russia? So those are reasons why the kind of analogy that I used with the Marshall Plan of thinking of a broad definition of the national interest is so important and so fitting today. And also an illustration of what I said as I started, that Biden's approach to how he is defining the national interest is very different from Trump's. And I think this announcement that we had yesterday and today at the G7 is a great example of this. Now, when we think about morals and their importance in foreign policy, there's a difference between morals and moralism. Americans tend to be moralistic. They talk a lot about their morals, but they don't always behave the way they talk. And that's what I call moralism. And sometimes people say, oh, well, you judge a president and his behavior in terms of his morals on foreign policy by whether he has good intentions. For example, when George W. Bush 43, invaded Iraq, Ari Fleischer, his press secretary, said, you had to admire his good intentions, and therefore this was a very moral foreign policy. But as we all know, good intentions aren't enough. Indeed, the proverb says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So I think good moral judgments, and this is what I try to argue in my new book, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from FDR to Trump, is you have to have what I call three-dimensional moral judgments, in which you look, yes, at the intentions, were the intentions good? And you have to then look also at the means that were chosen. Were the means appropriate means, and were they not just appropriate, but were they ethical? Did they consider the interests of others? And third, you have to look at the consequences and the probable consequences of the actions that you take. So that even though your intentions may be good, if you choose unethical means and have negative consequences, then the action as a whole fails what I call the three-dimensional moral test. In lawyers' terms, we would say that failure to think through the probable consequences of an action is failure to do due diligence, and the net result is culpable negligence. So we can judge foreign policy actions that way. Going back to Ari Fleischer's comments on Bush and the invasion of Iraq, let's grant Bush good intentions to bring democracy to the Middle East. But the means he chose were not the most ethical means. He was warned by papers prepared in the State Department and the intelligence community that we didn't have the capacity to do the things he was trying to do. Yes, we had the capacity through our hard power to overthrow Saddam Hussein, but the capacity to bring democracy to the area wasn't there. And the consequences, the unintended consequences, is rather than eradicating terrorism in the Middle East, we strengthened al-Qaeda in Iraq, which morphed into ISIS, the Islamic State, which had horrendous moral consequences for many people throughout the region and elsewhere. So you could argue that failure to do due diligence plus failure to think through possible unintended consequences led to culpable negligence. So as I would summarize the three-dimensional judgment on the invasion of Iraq, it would be that this was an immoral action, even if the intentions were good. Now, if we think that we have to judge presidents along these three dimensions of motives, means, and consequences, then we have to realize that there are always going to be difficult judgments. It's rare that everything turns out just right, and it depends a great deal on the context. In some contexts, it's much harder to do these balances. Henry Kissinger once said that most of the hard decisions in foreign policy are in the 51% to 49% range. And I think in that sense, when we make our historical judgments or contemporary judgments, we find that it's often not as easy. You can't get a perfect answer. Nobody gets a perfect score. And we can illustrate this with the issue of human rights. And again, we can compare Trump and Biden on human rights. You'll remember that the Saudi journalist, dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi, was assassinated and dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And Trump's reaction to this was, well, it's a rough world out there. Get over it. We need to sell arms to the Saudis, and we need to have stability in oil markets. And so I'm not going to criticize this. Biden had criticized Trump for this position. Indeed, the Trump position had been criticized by the Wall Street Journal, a conservative editorial page, which said that this underplayed American values. Biden criticized this in the 2020 campaign. Then the interesting question was, what was he going to do? Well, he wasn't obviously going to break relations with Saudi Arabia. There are other interests besides values interests and human rights interests, but he did have a declassified report of the responsibilities of the Crown Prince Salman, Mohammed bin Salman, and sanctions against 79 individual Saudis who had been involved. Now, for some people, they said that's not enough. You should have broken relations or withdrawn assistance to Saudi Arabia or something of that sort. But I think what he tried to do was a balancing job of saying, we do want to assert the importance of human rights, and that's why we're doing this public criticism. But we also realize that we have other interests in security and economics that have to be balanced in this. So in that sense, with human rights issues, it's important to assert the values that are in human rights, but to also realize that a human rights policy is not the same thing as a foreign policy. It has to involve the situation of trade-offs and different circumstances in different contexts. But there is a big difference, even if some people disagree that Biden did go far enough. There's a big difference between Biden's reaction to the murder of Khashoggi, which asserted or reasserted American values, and Trump's, which essentially ignored American values. And that, in turn, is important for American soft power. To conclude, let me say that in my book, I tried to look over the 14 presidents of the period since 1945. Biden will be the 15th, though he's not in the book, and to compare them and to rate them on this three-dimensional scale that I mentioned relating to their ethical foreign policy. The ones who came out top in my ranking were Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and the first President Bush, Bush 41. The ones who came out in the bottom quartile were Lyndon Johnson because of the imbroglio in the Vietnam War, Richard Nixon, larger for the same reasons, George W. Bush, Bush 43, largely because of Iraq, and Donald Trump because of the things that I've mentioned about undercutting American alliances and multilateral institutions. Now, the rest of the presidents were sort of spread out in between. As I mentioned, nobody got a perfect score, whether they were in the top or bottom group. And there's always going to be disagreement between people as they make these judgments on how to rate foreign policy presidents in terms of ethical criteria. But I think the important thing is not whether people agree or disagree with my particular judgments. The important thing is that we take morals and values seriously into account, because they do have a big effect on our soft power. And our soft power is an important part of how we will be able to manage a successful foreign policy. So let me stop there with my answers to this question of soft power and morals in US foreign policy, but I'd be very interested to hear questions and objections and alternative views from people who are listening in. So I'll stop for there.
Well, thank you, Joe, for your very insightful comment as always. And we're going to run the event like a Kennedy School seminar with the Professor Joe Nye. I thought your comment was very valuable when we really consider competition in Indo-Pacific. It's a competition of models, Chinese model, American model. It's a competition of attractiveness. And we all assume automatically that the American model is more attractive, of course, because of the emphasis on democracy, freedom, and human rights. But I think your comment has given us a lot of food for thought to think about this competition in the Pacific. Thank you very much. The first question is going to be Danny Russell, who's at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Danny?
Anyway, Joe, thank you. Great presentation. Sorry, I had a lot of buttons to press just there. I've been a foreign policy practitioner, so have you. And so I'm very curious about your thinking on the practical application of the sort of moral principles you've described particularly in executing foreign policy towards China. So you gave a concrete example of Biden's handling of the Khashoggi assassination, but that might be a bit of a sui generis case. And more broadly, the US as a nation today is just riven by all kinds of debilitating political polarization, social problems, wealth disparity, and so on. And so I think there's a whole range of things that may severely constrict the president's options, maybe denying him the luxury of some moral options. But in light of where the US is and where the world is, what kind of practical prescriptions do you have for dealing with China that flow from your three-dimensional scale?
Well, it's a great question, Danny, and you've lived through it. I guess what I would argue is that you've got to include values, but not to pretend the values are your only interest. My approach is to say values are one of the interests we have, but we also have economic interests and we have geopolitical interests. And the geopolitical interests include the interests of our allies like Japan. So as we approach the policy toward China, you could either say, well, forget all the human rights stuff, just dump it. Or you could say, let's focus just on human rights. And both of these are not workable. So I think the interesting question is, how do you assert American values, and yet at the same time, by criticizing Chinese policies in Xinjiang or Hong Kong, for example, and at the same time realize that we are going to have to do cooperate with China on issues like climate change. And we're also going to have issues that we have to manage, geopolitical issues like freedom of navigation in the South China Sea and so forth. So it is a balancing act. You have to do all of these things at the same time. My impression is that so far the Biden people are about on the right track on this. I mean, that they've been through this. These are your former colleagues. They've lived through this before, and they know something about balancing these different interests, including the values interests. So it'd be nice to say there's a neat formula. There isn't. It is one which requires a balancing act, and so far I think they're getting it about right.
Thank you very much. Danny, anything to follow on this?
Well, I'd love to, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Okay, well, okay, thank you very much. The second question is from Ambassador Melan Vervier. Melan Vervier is a member of advisory board as well. Melan?
Good to see you, Joe. Thank you so much. As Satahiro said, we're all your students, particularly on this issue. As you were speaking to us just now, breaking news, I don't know why it's breaking news, but maybe it says something about soft power, came across that the US image has improved dramatically among Europeans and Asians as a result of a recent Pew survey. And I wonder if you could comment on that in terms of what you just expressed as reflections of our values, reflections that our policies, for example, on climate change, may be contributing significantly to that impact, that image that seems to be taking hold now. At least we can hope it will last for a while.
I think I'm delighted to hear the results of that poll. And I think it's consistent with what I was just arguing, in the sense that, Donald Trump, by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords, essentially was sticking a finger in the eye of the rest of the world. And in addition to that, in withdrawing from the World Health Organization, which may have some problems, but it's all we got. We got to use it. That had very negative effects on the rest of the world. And his general attitude toward our alliances, of downplaying alliances, and it was all, what have you done for me lately? I think this had a very negative effect on American soft power. And it's interesting that essentially this then became low-hanging fruit for the Biden administration by immediately rejoining the Paris Climate Accords and the World Health Organization, and now with this new support for the COVAX facility for vaccines for poor countries, and by the general attitude toward reaffirming American alliances, Biden has been able to do a lot to restore American soft power. So what you just cited strikes me as good news, which is fully consistent with what I would have expected.
Thank you.
Perfectly timed.
Yes.
Thank you very much. It sounded like the question is whether United States can sustain this positive reaction from the international community. Joe Biden is obviously doing a great job, but we will see whether there will be a major political change in the future. And the next question is actually related to that from Mr. Eric Melby of Scowcroft Group. Eric asked, to what extent do you think Biden's effort to restore American soft power will be limited by foreign concerns that the GOP remains wedded to Trumpism and will regain control of one or both houses of Congress as early as next year? what advice would you give Biden to counter the inevitable skepticism that he will face in the meeting in Europe over the next week?
Well, that's a great question, Eric. You can't repair all the damage that was done to American soft power in just the first few months. I mean, as Milan said with this new Pew poll, it seems that Biden's initial actions of picking the low-hanging fruit have had an impact. But as many foreign friends have said to me, how do we know we're not going to get Trump back again or another Trump-like figure? So the sense of trust that was destroyed or undercut by Trump's actions isn't restored immediately. I mean, Biden's initial steps are exactly right, but he has to show consistency. And that also goes to the point about not just what the administration does, but what the American body politic does. If you have a situation where the Republican Party remains enthralled by Donald Trump and under his control, then that's going to make the trustworthiness of the United States less than it was. There's a saying that all politicians lie. Well, actually, all human beings lie. The big question is, what is the purpose of the lies and how many of them are there? If you believe the Washington Post fact-checking, you'll say that Donald Trump told something like 20,000 lies during his presidency. And when the lying is that frequent and that self-interested, it totally destroys trust. It debases the currency of trust. So the extent to which there's a fear that Trump may come back in 24 or keep control of the Republican Party means that trust, which is essential for our soft power, is still going to be incomplete. And there are going to be dangers that we will not as fully recover our soft power as we need to because of this. So yes, the things that Biden has done to restore soft power, which we already discussed, made good sense and seem to have had some effect. But if our allies feel, well, yeah, that's fine for now, but if we're going to wind up 4 years from now with the cycle turning back to what we saw over the last 4 years, we're not going to fully trust you, and that means our soft power is going to remain limited. So so the administration may be doing the right thing. Question of what happens to the Republican Party and the role of Trump remains a big, if you want, cloud hanging over the future.
Thank you very much. Considering the situation you just mentioned, do you think Nye Armitage policy foundation in Asia that requires sustained engagement with the region, do you think it can be sustained and maintained under this current political situation in the United States?
I think probably yes. And I think that in Asia, there is something of a bipartisan consensus in the US about the problems posed by the rise of Chinese power. And that has just reaffirmed what Rich Armitage and I have been arguing for 2 decades or more about the centrality and importance of the US-Japan alliance. The US and Japan as two democracies faced with a common rising power in the form of China and a sort of a rogue power in North Korea, really our fates are deeply intertwined. And in that sense, I think there's a pretty broad consensus in the US about the US position in Asia and particularly the US-Japan alliance. So I think that's probably, I think we'll do better in Asia. I worry a little bit about Europe, where the kinds of things that I mentioned about trust and whether Biden will be able to restore that trust. I think it's going to be a little tougher in Europe than it is in Asia.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Yoso Furumoto, Bureau Chief of Mainichi in Washington. A question regarding the President Biden's view of competition between democracies and autocracies. By promoting this dichotomic view, President Biden seems to be strengthening the cooperation between China and Russia. And if you think China is the biggest challenge to the United States, you need to cooperate with the non-democracy states, such as Vietnam or even with Myanmar. Do you have any suggestions on how you compromise strategic interest and democratic values? Maybe this dichotomy is not the dichotomy that you want, but this is a question from Mr. Yoso Furumoto.
Well, it's a very good question, and it goes back to Danny Russell's point about the practicalities of actually implementing policy, which includes the interests defined in terms of values and other interests. It will, as I said, it always will depend on context. In the largest sense, there is a danger of pushing China and Russia more tightly into an alliance. I think there's some limits to that. I mean, right now it's in the interest of China and Russia to cooperate because both of them want to limit the United States. But in the long term, for very real realpolitik reasons, Russia and China, I don't think are going to form the kind of alliance you saw in the 1950s. To put it crudely, in Siberia, Russia has a lot of empty real estate, and right next door, China has a lot of extra people. And there's a long history of what's happened along that border. So I don't think that, I think there are going to be limits on the China-Russia alliance that's being created. I think the harder questions come in terms of I think the Myanmar case is probably the hardest, which is how do you make sure that you express our disapproval of the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Myanmar and the brutality of the junta, and at the same time realize that that you have to have some relations because of the competition with China. Similarly, if you take the case of Vietnam, Vietnam is not a democracy, but it is interesting that the United States has worked closely with Vietnam despite that. And even with the Saudi case that I mentioned earlier, which is obviously not an Asian case, but a Middle Eastern case, despite the criticism of the Saudis on human rights, the United States realizes that it has economic and security interests in the Gulf, which depend upon the working relationship with Saudi Arabia. So as I said, it'd be nice if you could have a formula which everything, was immediately solved. In fact, depending on the context, you're going to have to balance out these different interests. My point is just don't forget that values are one of our important interests.
Thank you very much. Next question is from Yoichi Kato, who's now actually in Taiwan. China does not seem to be interested in a benign hegemony that empowers and legitimizes itself by getting respect and admiration from lesser states. Do you think there is any way to change this way or thinking of China, or the only way for the United States and the other democratic states is to overcome this challenge to overpower China by gaining more hard power and soft power?
Well, I think China is a major foreign policy problem, so I don't deny that. But in the area of soft power, I think the United States has major advantages over China. Indeed, if you think about it, ask yourself, does the Chinese authoritarian model pose a threat to, let's say, politics or inside the United States? No, nobody wants to be Chinese authoritarian Leninist party control in the United States or Japan for that matter. And yet, if you ask it the question the other way around, does the attractiveness of open discussion and freedoms for individuals, does that pose a threat to China and the Chinese political system much more than they pose to us? So in that sense, I think in the soft power domain, we have a certain advantage. In addition to that, I think Chinese soft power is limited by two factors. One is their insistence on tight party control on everything in civil society. So when China produces a genius like Ai Weiwei, he's essentially either put in prison or in exile. And that means that the part of a country's attractiveness or soft power that comes from civil society, not just government policy, is denied by the Chinese policy of clamping down so tightly on civil society. And the other thing that limits Chinese soft power is that they have territorial disputes with neighbors. For example, with India, with Japan, with Vietnam, with many others. And that sets a limit. You know, you can set up Confucius Institute in New Delhi to try to attract people to Chinese values. But if in the meantime, Chinese troops are killing Indian troops on the border in the Himalayas, that Confucius Institute isn't going to do much good. And you can see this if you look at what's happened to Indian attitudes toward China in the last year or so. So I think, and the same thing goes with Europe. You know, the Chinese spent a lot of effort over a number of years to get a China-Europe business investment treaty, which was finally signed in December. And then the European parliamentarians criticized Chinese behavior in Xinjiang. And the Chinese then basically issued sanctions against these members of the European Parliament, who then said, well, we're not going to ratify this treaty. So essentially the Chinese, in terms of soft power, the Chinese get in their own way. They step on their own message, as the saying goes. And so in terms of soft power competition, I'd much rather play the American hand than the Chinese hand.
Thank you. Next question is from Mr. Tamaki Tsukada, DCM of Japanese Embassy in Washington. The economists predict the US will be overtaken by China in terms of GDP in the future. To what extent do you think this will weaken US soft power?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think China does get a good deal of soft power from its economic performance. Many people admire the fact that China has taken a country out of poverty, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and produced a successful economy. And this is a source of attractiveness for China. So as China continues with its economic success, that will be an area for Chinese soft power, which is important. And that counterbalances the negatives that I mentioned about curtailing civil society and having conflicts with neighbors. I don't think, however, it's going to be enough to redress the balance and soft power overall. You know, for one thing, if you look at, if China becomes the world's largest economy measured at exchange rates sometime in the early 2030s, it still would be far from the world's largest economy in terms of per capita income. The Americans will still be many times richer than China in that. And in addition, China will be facing a number of other problems. Demography, the Chinese labor force peaked in 2015. The American labor force will continue to grow. China, in addition to that, will remain heavily dependent on imported oil, particularly from the Middle East, which has to cross the Indian Ocean, an area which has a very strong American naval presence. And the United States, in contrast, is going to be largely energy independent because of the shale revolution. And in the general areas of research and development for new technologies, while China has been improving, if you look at the underlying university structures, even China's own measurements by Shanghai Jiaotong University, of the top 20 universities in the world, 15 of the 20 are in the US. So the fact that Chinese aggregate GDP measured at exchange rates might be bigger than American in the early 2030s ignores all these other factors, which are very relevant to both hard and soft power.
Thank you. Joe, when you talk about soft power, you often talk about soft power United States based on a single country context. I was always interested in soft power in bilateral or in alliance structure. And I like to combine two questions in a similar fashion. They're asking questions. Question from Weston Konishi and Shihoko Goto of Wilson Center. Weston asked, soft power is often discussed in a unilateral context, but can you speak to whether soft power can have bilateral or even multilateral dimensions? For instance, is it possible for Japan and the United States to project soft power bilaterally in the context of a bilateral alliance? Shihoko asked, can differences in the implementation of a value-based foreign policy between the United States and Japan become a source of friction?
Well, in the second case first, yes. I mean, if, for example, the U.S. administration wants to place more emphasis, let's say, on the rights of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and Japan says, let's downplay this, yeah, that can create a certain amount of friction. On the other hand, since these are not absolute, since there's a question of balance that the U.S. has to make and Japan has to make, there are ways for the two sides to sort of prevent that friction from getting out of hand. So yes, it can be a source of friction, but it doesn't have to be in the bilateral relationship. On the question of can the cooperation between the U.S. and Japan enhance the soft power of both countries, I think the answer to that is clearly yes. Take this plan for dealing with COVID that I mentioned. That's something which not just U.S. and Japan, but the group of 7 as a whole could be working on. But if you take when the meeting of the Quad occurred earlier this spring with the US, Japan, India, and Australia, notice that they did talk a lot about public goods, in particular vaccines. And that enhances that cooperation enhances the soft power of all. And, or to take another case, if you look at the islands in the South Pacific, where China is making various efforts to provide aid to buy friendship, so to speak. The fact that Japan, JICA, and has done so much is absolutely crucial. And you could imagine more US and Japanese cooperation in areas like the South Pacific, reducing the attractiveness of the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think more cooperation on joint projects between the US and Japan would enhance the soft power of both countries.
Thank you. Next question is from Ms. Aiko Doden of NHK, and she essentially pointed out inability of United States to influence direction of Myanmar, particularly after junta take over the political authority. She said there may be no quick fix, but wouldn't the apparent inability to influence major actors in Myanmar undermine US statute and the very value that it purports to promote?
Well, Aiko's raised a very interesting and important question. I think the hard part now for the US is to figure out how do we make clear that the human rights violations and the destruction of democracy in Myanmar is unacceptable. At the same time that we don't want to totally break relations. We want to be able to continue to work with the government. And this is a classic case of a human rights policy where, and how it relates to foreign policy more generally. As I mentioned earlier, in the example of Saudi Arabia, you don't break relations when there's an important geopolitical interest. But on the other hand, you don't want to ignore the importance of your values as a type of interest. And how that's going to play out it will depend on what happens inside Myanmar, also on various interactions between the US and its allies as we approach the treatment of Myanmar. So Aiko is asking a very important question, and one where we're going to see a great deal more in the years to come.
Thank you. Japan is liked by most of the country in the world. It always come at the very top or close to the very top in international survey by BBC and others. Having said that, last question from anonymous attendee is, what do you think are the hallmark characteristics of Japanese soft power diplomacy?
Well, soft power of a country comes from both its government and its civil society. And Japan's civil society is very attractive. I mean, traditional Japanese culture is very attractive. That's been true for centuries. But if you look at modern Japanese culture and anime and Pokemon and so forth, obviously this is another strong source of Japanese soft power, which has nothing to do with government policies. But government policies also make a difference in the sense that if you look at JICA and Japan's aid to other countries, this is an important source of Japanese soft power. And the very fact that Japan is such a well-run, comfortable democracy, you go to Tokyo, you go to Japan, you feel things are running well, that you feel safe, you feel things this is a country you can admire. So there are lots of sources of Japanese soft power, and I suspect they'll continue to grow.
It's 10 o'clock, but I can't resist asking one last question, hearing what you just said. Japan and the United States has just had a very good summit meeting in Washington between Biden and Suga. Tokyo and Washington must feel pretty good about the bilateral relationship in the free and open Indo-Pacific context. Having said that, U.S.-Japan alliance look more and more like an anti-China alliance in the eyes of some of the ASEAN countries. Do you think this may undermine some of the traditional, peaceful state, so-called peaceful state of Japan's soft power image?
Well, I think it's crucial that while we realize that we have to balance Chinese power, we also have to live with China, and we want to both benefit from economic interdependence with China, but also we have to cooperate on what I call ecological interdependence, things like climate change. So we don't want the US-Japan alliance to be seen simply as a negative. And also there are other things such as North Korea, which the alliance is concerned about. So I think, as I say, the relationship between US and China, and I suspect Japan and China, is going to be what I call a cooperative rivalry. And the key to a successful foreign policy is to keep an eye on both sides of that statement, both the cooperation as well as the rivalry. And here I think the closeness of the US-Japan alliance is going to be beneficial to both of us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for spending your precious time with us, having a stimulating discussion. As I said, all of us are your student, and hope that we can continue to be your student in the future. And we are looking forward to working with you as an advisor to Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA. So thank you very much, Joe, for your time. And thank you very much for everybody. Bye-bye.
Good.